My name is Elin Gruffydd Jones, and I work in Trinity St. David's University and have been working in the area of translation and minority language for 30 years, a long time. David Gramling is a literary translator and modern linguist, working primarily from German and Turkish. His book, The Invention of Monolingualism by Bloomsbury, was published in 2016, and he won the Book Award of the American Association for Applied Linguistics in 2018. Then, with Aaron Aji, he translates the work of the Turkish poet and novelist Muratan Mungan, and he is also the translation section editor for the Duke University Press journal, Transgender Studies Quarterly, published by Duke University Press. Then, with Chantal Warner, he was the founding editor of the journal Critical Multilingualism Studies from 2012 to 2019. And also, he has two forthcoming books, The Invention of Multilingualism, Cambridge University Press, and Literature in Late Monolingualism, Stanford University Press. So a warm welcome to us, David. Prynhawn, good afternoon from us, but I'm aware that it's good morning from yourself over there, not in Texas today, but in Vancouver.
Prynhawn.
Mae gennym ni ddarlith sydd wedi recordio.
We have a pre-recorded lecture that you recorded for us very kindly last week when you were in the USA as opposed to being in Canada. We will play that in a moment. I am also aware that in your lecture you do talk about an area that discusses, a field that discusses languages in relation to each other and addresses the dynamic between languages and the power between languages. But I'm also aware of your work as a translator, a real translator, as it were, somebody who does translate practically between languages. So hopefully during the period of Q&A, we will have an opportunity to pursue both lines of thought in our conversation. So a warm welcome, David, and we look forward now to the lecture.
Shumai, Borreda. My name is David Gramling, and I'd like to thank the Learned Society of Wales for this wonderful re-invitation. I had, of course, meant to be with you in March of last year. And like everyone else, I was really crushed not to be able to make the trip. And I promised to make that trip as soon as I can to Cardiff. But for now, I'm calling in from an airport hotel in Tucson, Arizona, which is the indigenous land of the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaqui people. And this is many hours behind you in conference time. And so I hope you forgive me if I'm snoozing during some of the events today. But for now, Borreda from Tucson, Arizona. About 20 years ago, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and during her presidency of the Modern Language Association of America, the Latin Americanist Mary Louise Pratt penned an essay called Building a New Public Idea About Language, and that was in 2003. So she was looking around a linguistically abundant United States in this new 21st century, and Pratt found herself asking, nonetheless, what is wrong with this linguistic picture? In the years immediately prior, a law in the United States, in the state of California, known as Proposition 227, had all but eliminated bilingual public education for students there. And the young people she was meeting all around the country whose lives, and this is her writing, whose lives had produced strong incentives for them to learn and use other languages than English, were almost entirely on their own, unsupported by any meaningful public will to back up their learning efforts. And it seemed to Pratt that the country was just as fated as it had ever been before in this new century to double down on its nickname as the Cementerio de Lenguas, the Cemetery of Languages. There was a profound and growing chasm, Mary Louise Pratt saw, between the prevailing slogans and silences about linguistic diversity and the actual everyday practice of it in a range of communities around the country and beyond. So what Pratt foresaw in 2003 as a solution was a broad coalition of scholars, learners, teachers, policy makers, and community members who would commit long-term to the civic work of creating a new public idea about language, language learning, multilingualism, and citizenship. And this would include rediscovering the pleasures and pains of living multilingually in a country linguistically unequipped to apprehend its geopolitical situation. And again, that's a quote from Mary Louise Pratt. In calling the U.S. a linguistically unequipped country, Pratt did not mean that people living in the United States lacked language competence, so much as that the country's public sphere lacked the infrastructure, the will, the allocated money, and the conceptual language to foster collective language capacity, whether that be monolingual or otherwise. So in essence, Pratt wanted U.S. Americans, roiling as they already were in the belligerent contradictions of the early War on Terror period, to find the courage to correct a series of the nation's mythical presumptions about itself and its languages. Bilingual families and communities in America, Pratt insisted, prefer for their young people to remain bilingual and only discourage the maintenance of heritage languages when there is a credible fear in their midst of doing so. U.S. Americans of all backgrounds, she continued, were not hostile to multilingualism so much as they were ambivalent about it. But nationalist politicians had fueled the negative flanks of that public ambivalence, while language educators and advocates were effectively drowned out of the conversation on a topic about which they and their students were the living experts. Pratt echoed studies showing that it is never too late or too early to learn a language, and she completed her assessment by pointing out that even national security experts want language learning curricula to encompass far more than national security concerns alone. So the homework assignment for the country at the end of Pratt's 2003 essay included the following. First, showing monolingualism to be a civic hindrance to personal growth and to growth of the country as such. Two, taking steps to engage with and trust local heritage language communities rather than suspecting them of treachery or disengagement or disinterest. C, promoting advanced rather than shallow competence in additional languages. And D, establishing what she called linguistic pipelines at all levels of educational preparation. And getting collectively to work on these tasks of building coalitions, fueling more ambitious expectations, and reconceptualizing what languages mean in civic life were, for Pratt, the first steps in articulating this belated but new public idea she wanted her country folks to build through and with their languages. Though an occasional essay prompted by, quote, today's dramatic circumstances, and that was 2003, imagine how she would describe 2020, the wisdom of Pratt's simple proposals has held up very sturdily over the ensuing 2 decades. Very little about her depiction of a linguistically unequipped country has been revealed to be inaccurate. The endless War on Terror years, complicated by Trump and Brexit, have only deepened the importance of her and kindred interventions since the turn of the millennium. But like the 2007 Modern Language Association report, Foreign Languages and Higher Education, New Structures for a Changed World, Pratt's 2003 essay was an intervention in a particular, now historical moment. If we believe that the relationships among language and language learning and multilingualism and citizenship are historically dynamic, and that these interact continuously with all facets of social life and all features of technology and political economy, then 20 years is ample time to warrant new clarity and purpose around such a new public idea of multilingualism. Applied linguistics scholars and modern linguists have been leading that effort or pitching into it in various ways. And ultimately, Pratt's own suggested remedies in the 2003 essay regarding the United States' puzzling lack of investment in its own multilingualism were quite modest. But so has been the progress made on the various tasks that she and others have suggested. In the United States, which is of course only one small part of the picture that concerns us when we're talking about multilingualism, precipitous declines in language enrollments and closures of hundreds of language programs suggest a broad institutional misconstrual of Pratt's new public idea. And over the 2010s, successive generations of early career scholars and teachers have been structurally dissuaded from taking up language-oriented teaching and research vocations, unable to shield their eyes from the ominous predictions and the data about their career prospects in venues like the Chronicle of Higher Education, where the talk is bleak indeed. So for the United States, at least, the contemporary picture that begins to emerge is unsurprisingly perhaps one of an even more intricate and advanced paradox than Pratt had already described in 2003. The more talk there has been about multilingualism, the cleverer it seems have been the efforts to marginalize, instrumentalize, or tame it in practice. In the meantime, collective urgency around multilingual capacity building in neoliberal business management, just-in-time global industry, technological infrastructure, deep neural learning, economic modeling, transnational manufacture, and indeed, in some cases, educational legislation has boomed over these 2 decades. The race to multilingualize trade export, for example, has been profoundly rearranging both public discourses about multilingualism and the pathways of global content diffusion by way of multilingual technologies, fueling a kind of mutual feedback loop of canned ideas between these two. So multilingualism, as many powerful industries construe and supply it, may now be suppressing precisely the civic and social renaissance that Pratt had foreseen in 2003 for her linguistically unequipped country. After all, why would a reasonable 14-year-old not hedge her bets quietly around language learning when even the most persuasive messaging around her suggests that machines will do it faster and almost as well as she could? There's something quite reasonable and rational about those decisions to not learn languages in some ways. So such an irony, the suppression of what one purports to incite, may be one of the contemporary features of multilingualism that Alison Phipps was sensing in 2013 when she wrote the following, now almost a decade ago. She wrote, "Straining under the incompatible requirements of functionalism and deconstruction, multilingualism is increasingly unmoored. To be moored requires 2 anchors. Unmooring occurs when one or both of those are raised." Phipps's metaphor is subtle and suggestive. What have been these anchors of thought and strategy around multilingualism over the past half-century, in which Phipps suggests such strain and incommensurability were potentiated? Which anchors of economics, analysis, practical subjectivity, nationhood, etc., and political will have been raised even since Phipps's writing in 2013? And which new moorings around language may have been quietly implemented or re-engineered in their stead? So most readers of Pratt's 2003 guidance, whether they've come to it from literary studies or applied linguistics or public policy or curriculum reform movements, have been working hard in the past 2 decades to build such a new public idea of multilingualism in our midst. Indeed, many of us have dedicated entire new degree programs, centers, convention themes, conferences like this one, books, journals, curricular initiatives, and community solidarity endeavors to back up precisely the kinds of commitments Pratt and others sought to foster around 2000. So rather than lacking foresight, it seems that those of us who've been making these many efforts may have simply been beaten on our own turf by powerful interests far beyond modern languages and applied linguistics and beyond the social sciences and humanities more generally. These interests in multilingualism, oftentimes housed in finance, in logistics, and in engineering, have found fit in various ways, I think, to hijack, to repurpose, and in some ways upscale in very impressive ways multilingualism for what I see as ultimately monolingual effects. To be sure, platform and systems innovators themselves, which are diverse multilingual human teams who are very proud of their own work, would likely never see it this way. They would never dream that the resources they've created for us might ultimately be narrowing language practice over the long and even short term. We can credit these innovators for their work while critiquing their outcomes. But these innovations can also collude to produce a vague psychic dissonance in potential learners, a structure of feeling we might even call a loss, or with the philosopher Kate Mann, a melancholy, around the experience they may no longer quite be able to enjoy directly, that of dwelling in and with many languages, without a battery of tools and instruments and gadgets to mitigate the phenomena of such dwelling. Surrounded, as young people may be, by so many promising problem-solving, troubleshooting solutions, some would-be learners may have fewer prompts and spaces to live multilingually in the social world and to articulate the psychic and affective dimensions of that experience. This melancholy and dissonance can, I propose, become one of our most potent critical resources as we seek to make good on Pratt's prompt from 20 years ago. But computational engineers and commercial clients in our era are merely, in a lot of ways, following the patterns set out for them by the political economies of the early 20th century post-imperial era, which solidified what counted and did not count as a language. And so in matters of technology, engineering, and commerce, we must always be willing to imagine, and also imagine with our colleagues in engineering, for example, the way things could be fundamentally otherwise than they are, given a different vision of what language is in the plural and in the singular. We could imagine multilingual platform innovators engineering a lovely and experiential commons, maybe a kind of anti-gravity machine for multilingualism and translanguaging, one that would prompt exhilarating simulations that make all kinds of people marvel and want more. But my point is that this is by far not the lion's share of what is on offer amid the booming technological innovation around multilingualism in this age. The predominant energy is rather that of solving the problem of multilingualism while doing it in the name of multilingualism. And every day, engineers raise tiny flags of triumph in that effort, and each of those tiny flags gives some learner somewhere the dubious consolation that their own language learning energies are less and less needed in this world. The language paradox of the United States over this period is only one part of the story. There are, of course, the world over, a venerable range of mutually contradictory multilingualisms and monolingualisms undergoing constant and subtle change, none of which is more authoritative or legitimate than the next for the purpose of defining these terms. So for me, the ism at work in my own use of the word multilingualism is not a tag indicating a unified conception, ideology, or program. Like feminism, the ism in multilingualism points shimmeringly to a diverse and divergent historical constellation of practice, envisioning, and thought about how the world could be understood otherwise than it has been in the orthodoxies of modern colonial structures. And yet, just as feminism has been, the term multilingualism is under extraordinary and unabating pressure to mean often contradictory things and fulfill opposing interests. This pressure comes not only from within academic communities, but from much wider discursive shifts. I personally had previously joined leading applied linguistics scholars in making the claim that one can use bilingual and multilingual somewhat interchangeably. Now, in retrospect, that somewhat in that proviso of mine seems problematic, and I would like to take it back in some ways. Though there are salient features of the mind, the brain, embodiment, and subjectivity that suggest that we make a stronger distinction between bilingual and multilingual experience, this is actually not the primary reason why I now wish to reconsider that conflation. My own wish to hold the two concepts separate, bilingualism and multilingualism, springs from a different and admittedly belated recognition I made, which several applied linguists' work has brought to light for me. Which is that of multilingualism as a kind of de-ethnicized rebranding of bilingualism. And I should mention Noah Katz-Nelson and Katie Bernstein's 2017 article on this concept of rebranding. So prominent policy discourses on multilingualism have been forged upon economic and technological ventures that diverge sharply from the advocacy and solidarity work through which bilingualism and bilingual experience were uplifted in the 1960s and 1970s, long before there was a coherent policy discussion on multilingualism in the United States or the European community, or any effective technologies to harness it commercially. Back then, there were both spirited advocacy and public controversy around bilingual education, particularly from a heritage language point of view and led by Latinx and other scholars of color. Multilingualism is quite a different kettle of fish, but I do believe that multilingualism is still a meaningful and capacious idea, one with a promising, tumultuous, and flawed present, yes, but a future worth caring for in research and public life. Despite its terminological vulnerabilities and its technological instrumentations, multilingualism is usefully able to encompass complex, divergent, and sometimes opposing experiences and ideas. It does so in a wider range of planetary contexts, fictitious and real, political and social, north and south, colonial and decolonial, individual and collective, oppressive and liberatory, embodied and prosthetic, present and past. And so I do consider multilingualism to be a really key topic these days, not just a rebranded kind of slogan. But the metaphor of the key is really important. A key turns a lock both to open and to close something. In the 21st century, keys are no longer just made of steel, brass, or rope. They are now also made of digits and biometric data that transcend local conditions and rely on vast systems of compliance and coordination. Multilingualism is now a key in all of these chrono-diverse ways. It enfranchises and excludes, it invites and dissuades, it recognizes and surveils, it confirms and denies. Some of us in 2020 continue to prefer to hold on to our old brass keys in the hopes that we will not have them replaced against our wishes by proprietary gatekeeping mechanisms beyond our handy control, and so too is it with multilingualism. So I'd like to propose that multilingualism is itself always, among otherwise good things, a practice under pressure, under the pressure of powerful discourses and dispositives that yearn to impose order and organization on people, meanings, and meaning-making possibilities in space and life. For many powerful institutional designers today, multilingualism fulfills a specific historical thirst for reinstating order, and orders are always built upon the identification, management, and curtailment of their constitutive outsides. But such an opportunistic fastidiousness flies in the face of a basic sociolinguistic insight, which is that the practice of multilingualism is historically, planetarily, and indeed linguistically unmanageable. And the hunch that this may be so, that multilingualism is fundamentally unmanageable, tempts a lot of policymakers to take refuge in authoritative or reductive definitions motivated by collective or elite desires, fears, investments, and also a fair bit of denial. Those who, for an apparently good faith reason, seek to delimit multilingual experience for policy purposes may tend to force their fellows and collaborators to produce consensus and compromise on a definition where there simply cannot be any, or cannot be any yet. In the coming decades, multilingual experience will likely become even harder to distill into a definition or policy platform than it is today, and I think that is perhaps a good thing. It often confounds institutional virtues of transparency, efficiency, and accessibility, for example, to acknowledge the ways that lived multilingualism creates problems, messes, intractabilities, disorderliness, opacity, and slowness, even and especially in the definition of the term itself. So in some ways, it's very good medicine for us in this neoliberal era. It slows our initiatives and our interventions. It makes grants involving multilingualism in some meaningful way harder to get, justify, and credibly report on. It makes, in some ways, the goal of universal accessibility prized, somewhat superficially, I would say, by universities these days, infinitely harder to deliver upon authentically, such that language, accent, and multilingual practice are actually often quietly left out of university diversity and inclusion statements. In a language indifferent institutional policy environment, universal design efforts can end up turning a potentially multilingual curriculum into an English medium curriculum overnight. But I think if we're thinking about it right, shouldn't multilingualism make assessing student work, hiring new personnel, and building curricula and programming a dicier, a more wayward, a less predictable proposition? Once during a university pre-accreditation process, I was tasked by my associate dean with checking over 1,000 syllabi to make sure each had appropriately formulated student learning outcomes. And I did as I was asked, but I had to be a little bit proud as I noticed how the handful of colleagues who wrote their syllabi in languages other than English were much bolder than those writing in English in resisting the purportedly language-neutral values and desired idioms of the audit I'd been charged with. And this reminded me again how multilingualism offers up an enduring gift of opacity we should never wish away. And I know that's difficult for all of us when we're filling out research fish, for example. Facing down capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, and neoliberalism, multilingual forms of subjectivity throughout modernity have created shelters where people can resist those systems' demands to be heeded, to be listened to. But this opacity is a wild gift, and it has never signaled an intention to become docile and programmatic in the course of time. Such is the lively tension between the dispositive and the lived experience of multilingualism in our age. As thoughtful groups of people consider together how to program sound curricula, rethink methodology, and conceive public policy with multilingualism in mind. I've been introducing a few neologisms of late to help me deal with some of these tensions. These are not meant to confuse matters further so much as to take some of the pressure off of multilingualism. It seems to me that this word is expected to do more and more disparate and often contradictory signifying work in the literature and in policy, and I find value in splitting the concept in ways that other scholars, to my knowledge, have not yet had reason to do. So these neologisms are as follows. I use the word supralingualism, which I consider to be a supply-side industrial conceit, and a capacity, which has been developing since 1990 in earnest, but we could trace it all the way back to, I think, the late 17th century, particularly in London. And supralingualism is designed to forge translatabilities as commodities and to trade on them, so to sell those translatabilities to clients and end users. Supralingualism is a powerful, innovative means to diffuse meanings reliably and regularly from one language to another, rather than compelling speakers of a language to use loanwords or learn new languages entirely. So you can see supralingualism in industrial coordination across the world, starting in the late 17th century. You can see it now in both national security coordination, interagency, interoperability, but you can also see it in the diffusion of far-right concepts from language to language over the past 40, 50 years. A second is ordolingualism. Ordolingualism is a more economistic model of multilingualism, so not necessarily its technological manifestation. And it is derived in my usage from the ordoliberal economics of the 1930s through the 1970s. And you can see Quinn Slobodian's 2018 book, The Globalists, for a wonderful introduction to it. I use the word ordolingualism to talk about the practice and principle of adjusting languages to one another into a global order that minimizes protectionism, opacity, decolonial resistance, and other barriers to the free flow of capital. Key to ordolingualism and ordoliberalism is that they tolerate and promote cultural expression and difference only to the degree that it does not hamper free trade. I also use the term late monolingualism, which I consider a historical era beginning in the mid-1980s to, and it'll probably last, I think, till about 2040, when nationalist monolingualism is suspected in some ways to be in decline and is therefore being refortified with new technologies, policies, curricula, and citizenship protocols, not to mention, fascist movements, so as to protect so-called monolinguals from globalization and the destabilizing effects of other languages and their meanings. The term late monolingualism is designed to shift the punitive weight off of the word monolingual, off of persons and onto political economy. So much as Werner Sombart did with the term late capitalism in the early 20th century, the purpose of the term late monolingualism is to show that monolingualism is a changing, historically sedimented, but not necessarily declining system. Its lateness refers not to an eventual demise, but to the resurgent intensity and innovativeness with which its defenders will seek to uphold it in the coming decades, often through forms of so-called multilingualism, which even when those defenders of monolinguals are not ideological nationalists in any conventional sense. And I use a slash in the word monolingualism, so a slash between mono and lingualism, to denote that there is a mutually reinforcing relation between monolingualism and lingualism. So lingualism being the belief in the essential integrity of individual languages, their countability, their nameability. And I get this slash from the historian Jonathan Dollimore, who in 1991 used a slash rather than a hyphen in a similar way in his use of the word postmodernism, so as to indicate that this post was not a temporal distinction from a pre-existing modernism so much as a relation between modernism and the critical resistance to it. And one more term that has been really useful for me in characterizing each of these three overlapping structures is monolanguage, by which I mean the arduously and historically produced integers of language, so French, English, Chinese, Afrikaans, Korean, etc., that stand barely questioned and yet ubiquitous in a vast array of functional roles, despite the ample counter-evidence showing their untenability on the evidence. So speaking of a US-American monolanguage of English sounds absurd on the evidence until one starts to enumerate the endless range of real-world circumstances in which that label is made consequential and, in some ways, inevitable for and by people. So these few neologisms are meant to relieve from multilingualism and monolingualism, I think, to some of the explanatory burdens that have been put upon them in the last quarter century. They help me in distinguishing experience from discourse and highlighting different kinds of discourses and dispositives when it is prudent to do so. But unlike translanguaging and other terms current in applied linguistics, ordo and supralingualism, for example, are not models of practice that I endorse. They serve supremacist, neocolonial, racist, anti-democratic purposes from which I believe future conceptions of multilingualism must work to be distinguished. Whereas Kramsch 2009, Claire Kramsch, and Kramsch and Zhang, Livua Zhang 2017, premised multilingualism on lived and shared experience primarily. I think that our evolving historical movement is facing a specific kind of discourse that threatens to overpower or shout down those experiences of multilingualism that they document. And it is only facing the discursive power of the word multilingual in its various kinds of political, industrial, technological, and commercial usages these days, and economic usages, that I believe we can continue to use the word at all, and use it we must indeed. So this project of viewing multilingualism as a historically situated dispositive is not merely an exercise in criticism for criticism's sake. What would be the virtue of undermining or casting doubt on a principle in which so many teachers, scholars, policymakers, and learners find imminent value and indeed hope? Rather, the critical approach to multilingualism openly intends to strengthen rather than controversialize the usability of this beloved and visionary concept. And I am committed to honoring the work that various practitioners do differently in the name of multilingualism. In the end, multilingual is a word that lives a social life, just like any other lightning rod word, like organic or romance or communication or socialism or intersectionality or home. All words and ideas under adverse and compromising circumstances can have their meanings drained, conscripted, or inverted, and the circumstances facing the word multilingualism these days are compromising indeed. But I do want to give the word and the idea of multilingualism a fair shake in a historical moment where it is under intense discursive pressure from many sides. On the one hand, the word multilingualism is under acute pressure to bear the demands of new global supply chains, profit margins, and supranational unions. On the other, it is under pressure to step aside and make way for better, more apparently just descriptors of linguistic practice. But one does not need to defend multilingualism in order to acknowledge these acute and contradictory demands on it. And as such, multilingualism is not an idea that must fall victim or has irrevocably fallen victim to academic sloganization, neoliberal marketization, institutional opportunism, or to the coloniality of power. Like any other useful word, it is always susceptible to these forces and must be ready to sustain the critical contestations those forces bring forth. Blackledge, Crease, and Taki 2014 make a similar point when they highlight how heteroglossia is a theoretical term is by definition itself also heteroglossic. It is so like multilingualism because it has been translated and retranslated, debated and redebated across many traditions and communities, such that a harmonious shared meaning is simply no longer in the cards. This state of things does not make the concept of heteroglossia or of multilingualism any less useful or powerful. The problem is only that those technological advancements that we see around multilingualism seek to repair and foreclose the undoing and the mess and sometimes the revelation that lived multilingual offers, and in so fixing leaves less and less room for the possibility that human beings value and love those messy, meaningful, embodied features as much as they value operational efficiency. The philosopher Judith Butler suggests why it is that such undoing and messiness is necessary to our subjectivity, and how undoing is ultimately a reconstitution dressed as a dissolution, and why we so frequently seek through technological fixes, for instance, to escape its effects. So this is Butler. What we call independence is always established through a set of formative relations that do not simply fall away as action takes place, even though those formative relations sometimes are banished from consciousness, even arguably must be banished to some extent. If I can come to touch and feel and sense the world, it is only because this I, before it could be called an I, was handled and sensed, addressed, and enlivened. Though Butler does not speak here of multilingualism as such, she nonetheless puts a finger on the urge to banish from liberal individualism any vulnerable dependence on the world and on its meaning-making diversity, amid which we are each indeed meanings made by others even before or as we become ourselves. So that's enough from me. George and Vau Reon Ihi, and I look forward to our discussions. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, David.
Thank you very much, David. We have had a very rich lecture, very challenging perhaps on the first listening, and which raises a number of points that we can now try and discuss in a way that perhaps we can now discuss. I can see that there's one question in the Q&A, but before I ask Claire whether she'd like to ask that question herself, I'd like to start with one short question myself. Listening to your lecture there, and I could see the type of reference that you'd used, and you were quoting so many different academic writing from females in particular. It did strike me that we don't always, outside of the fields of study of gender, we don't usually have lectures where we have so many references from female academics. Do you have any comments on that as we begin this discussion?
Yes. So can you hear me okay, Elin? Okay, great. Thank you so much for that question. It had not occurred to me when I was, preparing this that was a feature. But I have to say, and this is something that I'm really learning in 2020, is that the people who have really carried, particularly in the United States, the people who have carried the language learning, who've been the leaders in the language learning profession since 1980 have been predominantly women. And a lot of them are retiring right around now. And their kind of time of impact and leadership was 1975 to 2020. And it is really wonderful and exciting for me to see these scholars who often in their early careers had to fight tooth and nail to have their expertise as foreign language pedagogy experts and researchers recognized by their field. They often had to slog through all sorts of institutional hierarchy to even achieve that basic level of recognition in the 1980s. These women became generals. I mean, I think of them as generals, you know, in a military metaphor, but they, over the decades, you know, I think of Heidi Burns, I think of Claire Kamsch, became these kinds of, you know, storied historians and leaders of all of the, I mean, I saw Claire's question in the Q&A, all of these amazing grassroots efforts to change the way people discuss language learning, discuss the role of language learning at universities, for example. And so I suppose it was not intentional, but it's also not incidental that women play such a key role in, you know, what I've learned. Also, I mean, Mary Louise Pratt is a fascinating person because she, as many others that I've just named, are these border crossers between disciplines. I mean, Mary Louise Pratt and Elizabeth Traugott wrote a book in the 1970s called Linguistics for Students of Literature. And even in 2020, that is a controversial proposition. Usually we, you know, separate linguistics and literature, at least in the United States. Even when I hear in a Welsh and in a British context, for example, the term modern linguist, that in the United States is on its own a controversial term because we in the US tend to really separate linguistics and literature in this really, really old-fashioned way that Mary Louise Pratt and others really rejected in the 1970s. So these are the cutting-edge forerunners of thought, and I suppose it's not an accident that they play such a central role.
Well, I think that now takes us to the direction of Claire's question when we think about how some academics have played a role of being campaigners as well. Engagé is the French term, and that they work with the community and campaign alongside their academic work. Therefore, Claire, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, super. Yeah. No, thank you, David. That was a stunning lecture. Really, really engaged by it. And I can see fully where you're trying to expand in a really capacious manner the ways in which the multilingual encompasses, you know, transnational movements and developments. But I wonder, and it's drawing on the discussion with Elin there about activism, I wonder what's the role for the grassroots? Because your lecture, stunning as it was, can give a sense of powerlessness to some extent. What can happen to people on the ground? Can Jordan in Merthyr Tydfil make a difference? Can Claire in Edinburgh make a difference? I.e. young people, because I'm really, as an activist academic myself, I'm really engaged by young people being able to make us, have a stance, make a difference. And I think that that's a really important part of that rootedness of the multilingualism. And I wanted to know what you thought about an activist, not only academics, but people in the community as well.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. It's a crucial question, and I think my sense for it is that, I mean, you know, I'm really I'm indebted. None of my work would be here if it weren't for language activists. Many of them anti-racist language activists, Latinx scholars and activists from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s in the United States, Turkish language activists in Germany. And so I think what I see happening, and if the talk gave projected a landscape of powerlessness, that is probably not incidental. And the reason for that is that as I see it, there are new foes. There are new opponents or rivals in defining what language is and what linguistic competence is. And they're rather new. I mean, all the way up until the 80s, 90s, we had kind of traditional language elites or language elitists that tried to convince this or that person that their language was inadequate. Debbie Cameron, for example, writes about that in Verbal Hygiene, her wonderful 1995 book. But I think what we have now is something new, which is we have elites who themselves have prescriptive concepts of what proper multilingualism is. And so in these, the example I'd give is this, in the state of Utah in the United States, a state legislature that has kind of made all these laws about multilingual competence without consulting the actual Spanish-speaking community that they're legislating about. So this is a phenomenon that some scholars call disinclusion. So when a state legislature or some policy body decides that multilingualism is really important, but it wants to do so in a kind of clean, industrial, kind of commercial way that that doesn't make much room for actual people, and that is somewhat hostile to the way people actually speak, the way people actually feel about language. And so it ends up disincluding precisely the communities that that multilingualism, as I see it, is intended to uplift and to center. So this, for me, is a new problem. It does create new potentials for powerlessness. You know, back in the 60s and 70s, the oppositions were usually something along the lines of monolingualism versus multilingualism, or monolingualism versus bilingualism. That was the kind of tension. And now it's different versions of multilingualism. Does your, you know, UNESCO version of multilingualism, does that include my community and my people and my experience of language, or does it invisibilize that experience? And so I think when we think of individual activists, community organizations, and also just our endeavors, the way we shape conferences, the way we shape curricula, the question for me is how, I think of the decolonial feminist Maria Lugones idea of a peopled ground. So is our multilingualism actually peopled, or is it people-less, which is in some ways, I think, what some of these new laws about or kind of programs around multilingualism in the United States are, is they're oftentimes conceived at the expense of actual speakers or actual users of language, and it has a very abstract and dry conception of what multilingualism is supposed to be. And so that just makes it harder for activists. It makes it much more important for us to listen very closely to what young people say language is, to what they say matters to them in the use of meaning-making repertoires, and to be very, very careful as we use categories, you know, what counts as a language, what types of variations or variants of a language are we acknowledging, what counts as a language that can make meaning, make knowledge, and what languages are being excluded from that process. And of course, that oftentimes comes down to, you know, classroom interactions, curriculum development, and discussions with colleagues between communities and educational institutions.
Diolch, David. Da ni'n hoff iawn.
Thank you, David. We really like the linguistic campaigning in Wales, and we've been busy doing that for a number of years. And also, one of the things that strikes me from my personal experience as well, when we campaign, when we live our lives and insist on living our lives in the Welsh language and taking that control over living our lives in Welsh, we are able to also influence, particularly with such a relatively small language, with a relatively small number of speakers, we as individuals and activists and campaign groups are able to shape our language linguistically as well. And I think, you know, talking from a personal experience with regard to my identity as a Welsh speaker, and also as somebody who's come out as gay, who as a parent as well, and the type of language that we've developed in that sub-community, if that's an acceptable term. We are the ones who have shaped that language. And just thinking about the past few months and the Black Lives Matter campaign and the primarily online debates about what there should be in Welsh. And some people argue that you shouldn't translate it, that you should just not have a Welsh language term. And others say, no, we need to have a Welsh language term for it. Do we use Mae Bywydau Dion or Bwys? But then the answer is, Mae Bywydau Dion Bwys, because that was what was on the placard and used by the people who had taken ownership of that debate. Therefore, our linguistic activism is an experience that's a lived experience, but our more broader society needs to be part of that campaigning and activism as well. And it's not just the activists, everyone should be campaigning. So if we come to some of the other questions in the Q&A, and remember, if you want to ask a question yourself, you're welcome to do so. But if you want to just type it, that's fine as well. So this is the question, a very rich lecture. Can you tell us more about the relationship, bilingualism and multilingualism? And is it that multilingualism is a more acceptable dressed up version of bilingualism? And I think that we in Wales live here in Wales and so dominated by English in terms of what it conveys to us as citizens that we feel that the complete exception here. So clearly there is a dynamic, isn't there, between the monolingualism that we live within. So over to you, David.
So there's two parts to that, and I do feel that. Well, first of all, I should say that my original intention was to come all the way to Cardiff and walk around and learn. I had actually in planning for this event back in March, I had planned some Welsh lessons. I had planned all sorts of things, and as happened to every single one of us, those hopes had to be deferred. I've learned a lot about translanguaging in Welsh since the mid-1980s. It is, Wales has been an absolute crucible for some of the most critical and important concepts to all of us around the world. I just imagine those early days when imperial monolingualism and a particular kind of nationalist separatism in language was not working for everyone, and that a new conception of translanguaging as a potential to see the way languages could actually enliven one another. So the problem wasn't this versus that; it was it was this, presuming that you needed one or the other language rather than the friendship between them. And of course, if, it doesn't have to be a starkly political history that defines what that friendship is. If Welsh and English live together in one body or in one community or in one family, for example, then there is a friendship there, regardless of the colonial history, regardless of the imperial power, et cetera. And so acknowledging the ways that two languages, three languages can enliven one another, make one another more vivid. I mean, I'm thinking about the Black Lives Matter example.
and how it doesn't come down to choosing one or the other. They can both be there. You know, the Welsh version of Black Lives Matter and the English one, the African-American vernacular English one, can be together, and it becomes the relation between them rather than the one or the other. I think one thing that monolingualism makes us do is choose. We have to have this or that. The only legitimate basis for being or for thinking is to choose one or the other, and that's a premise of monolingualism that I think we have to reject. And I think that that Welsh speakers and activists have been doing that since the 70s at the latest. So you know, I'm an admirer from afar. And to the question of whether multilingualism is a dressed up version of bilingualism, I think it really is. I think, you know, as I said in the talk, I believe in the future of the usefulness of multilingualism as a term, but we have some work to do on that term, because in some ways, multilingualism became, in the 1990s and 2000s, a depoliticized, de-ethnicized version of what bilingualism had been before. Bilingualism meant a lot for Latinx, Chicanx, activists in the United States in the 70s and 80s, for Asian American activists who were fighting really, really important battles. And in some ways, the pivot between as Noah Katznelson and Katie Bernstein tell it, between 1996 and 2015 towards replacing bilingualism with multilingualism was really a deliberate attempt to reclaim a valuable resource for the already powerful. So to give, you know, in the United States, to give white students the resources of bilingualism that had been the pride and heritage of Latinx and Asian American, you know, learners, for example, was we have bilingualism. I think a lot of elites in the United States, a lot of you know, white lawmakers, for example, really didn't like that, and they wanted to have their own version of this. And so the word multilingualism started to actually appear in state legislation in the 2000s, and it was a very kind of it was a very strange appearance, because those were the same lawmakers that had abolished bilingual education in the 1990s. So it was the same people and the same mouths that were kind of creating this legislation, but now they were talking about multilingualism instead of bilingualism. So it's problematic. It is. We have a lot of reckoning to do with that transformation, and I'd be really eager to know how this plays out in Welsh discourse, for example.
Can I just write question bach?
May I just make a supplementary comment to what you've just said, and thinking about the movement from bilingualism to multilingualism in the context of the USA? Is there a suggestion that this is in order to prevent the overdevelopment of Spanish as a language for social cohesion? Is that the reason? We're looking at the language policy in Catalonia at the moment, and certainly one of the things stated clearly is that Catalan, not Spanish, but you know, Catalan is the language for social cohesion, the language for education, the common language for all citizens who live there, or everyone who lives there, no matter where they've come from or what their citizenship is. And then that Spanish is a language, of course, it's a common language, but that it's not only through Spanish that the social cohesion happens. So was there a suggestion that Spanish was getting too powerful in the USA and challenging English as the language of social cohesion?
Absolutely. And before I forget again, I'd like to thank our interpreter for you know, because Yeah, I'm just very grateful. This is how these conversations get to be had, and so thank you to our interpreter. Um, yes, absolutely. I mean, the state of Texas almost flipped for Joe Biden. I mean, come on. This is a moment where the power of Latinx communities, the power of African American communities in the United States is causing such a radical and very dangerous backlash. And a lot of the and of course, one of the ways that that backlash seeks to contain and minimize Black and Latinx Americans is to constrain how much we recognize about the way Black and Latinx Americans make meaning and how they make meaning together, and so one of the responses, as is typical, is to try to control what the repertoires are by which people can build social relations. Social relations is something that is absolutely crucial to African American communities, to Latinx communities, and something that frankly the United States has a really hard time acknowledging and making policy around. Social relations is not really the priority in a free market economy. And so you get all of these legislators trying to take a valued, treasured repertoire away from the people it belongs to, refashion it, re-engineer it, and then give it back to them and everyone else in a new alienated form. I think that's what's happening. I think that's why, and the scholar Guadalupe Valdez wrote about this in 1996. She said, watch out, because what is happening right now with dual immersion programs, English, Spanish, she was talking about California and the US Southwest, I think, is a little bit dangerous because these dual immersion programs are actually serving the interests of dominant, predominantly monolingual white speakers much more than they're actually serving the interests of Latinx bilinguals. And over time, that is going to accrue to a type of symbolic power for Anglo young people rather than for the communities for which these programs were actually designed.
Diolch, da ni wedi cael caniatad I fynd
Thank you. We've had permission to carry on until 3:15, so 5 or 6 minutes. There's a question here from Joe Boyle.
How has this affected the country's sense of itself as a world power? Gai gynnig hwnna I ti rwan, David.
Can I ask you that now, please, David?
Could you say that one more time, please, Elin?
You referred to the US as a cemetery of language. How has this affected the country's sense of itself as a world power?
Yeah, cemetery of language, or cementerio de lenguas, is a concept that Mary Louise Pratt kind of writes about, and it really starts with Teddy Roosevelt, the early 20th century president of the US, who was really, I mean, it's hard for us to get this history right, but the United States was a profoundly multilingual place all the way up until the early 20th century, all the way up until World War I, where it became, all of these state legislatures started to ban German, started to, really coalesce strategically around English. That's something that really only happened in an effective way around World War I. So you had 140 years of this country called the United States. And I'm a little conscious that I'm focusing far too much on the United States at this point, but that really only became ideologically monolingual around World War I. And so, and that was something that was in some ways by design. So Theodore Roosevelt saying, yeah, it's cool if everybody comes here, but they need to leave their languages at the door, because we need a basic shared idiom in order to function as a society. And that presumption that monolingual multiculturalism was going to be the kind of entry-level presumption for the society was kind of it was a really new thing in the 19 teens. And so that is kind of where this process, this idea of the cemetery of languages was really born. And of course, that is really quite contemporaneous with the United States' rise as a world military power. You know, and the idea that a country needs a shared idiom is also, you know, that's very questionable. I mean, Switzerland does pretty well. Wales does pretty well. I think the presumption that we need a common language is it hasn't been tested adequately for accuracy in many different areas. And so, you know, multilingual communities, multilingual polities, countries do really, really interesting, powerful things. You know, I think about Cameroon, I think about Nigeria, I think about really interesting kind of experiments in kind of community multilingualism that this idea of monolingual multiculturalism really has not been able to acknowledge in the United States. How it has affected the US as a world power, I think that remains to be seen. It's going to be, the next 20 years are going to be wild because, and this is why I call this kind of late monolingualism, the things people are going to do to try to retain that image of a country with a shared language. It's going to be wild to see what types of reactionary efforts come forth in order to preserve that image of a monolingualism that never actually existed. And we see this in some ways in the European Union too. So it kind of control mechanisms to harness and manage the way languages are allowed to thrive and transform.
And certainly, ac yn sicr mewn
And
ynghyd-destun.
certainly in the context of translation and the role of professional translators and creating translation systems that then revalidate the language that that people speak, etc. There have been a number of interesting developments ahead of us. I'm afraid that we've reached the end of the session, even with our additional time for questions. There are some additional questions in the Q&A, but perhaps what we'll do is provide some answers via the chat. So to bring the session to an end formally, and to thank David very much for an extremely special and rich lecture, and also the discussion afterwards.